Wife mysteriously disappeared. Mistress thought she won. Then the FBI crashed her celebration. The champagne flute trembled in Victoria Hale's manicured fingers as she gazed out at the sprawling estate that was now, finally, hers. 3 months had passed since Sarah Chen Morrison had vanished without a trace, and the legal proceedings had moved with surprising swiftness. The missing person case had gone cold, the insurance money had been released, and David Morrison, her lover of 2 years, had proposed just last week. To new beginnings, Victoria whispered to her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been Sarah's home office. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was celebrating in the very room where Sarah had spent countless hours building the tech startup that had made the Morrison family wealthy beyond measure. David emerged from the kitchen, his salt and pepper hair, perfectly styled, carrying 2 glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. At 52, he still possessed the commanding presence that had first attracted Victoria at that charity gala 2 years ago. She had been 28 then, a struggling marketing consultant drowning in student loans. Now, she was about to become Mrs. Morrison, inheriting not just a husband, but an empire worth $47 million. "I can't believe she's really gone," David said, though his tone lacked the grief one might expect from a recently widowed man. "After 15 years of marriage, I thought I knew her better than anyone." Victoria accepted the champagne, letting her fingers linger against his. "People hide their darkest secrets from those closest to them," she murmured. "Sarah probably planned this disappearance for months. New identity, offshore accounts. It's easier than you think to vanish completely." They had crafted this narrative together over the past 3 months. Sarah Chen Morrison, brilliant entrepreneur and devoted wife, had suffered a mental breakdown under the pressure of her failing company. The tech bubble had burst, investors were pulling out, and the stress had driven her to the breaking point. One morning, she simply walked out of their Malaton estate and never returned. The police had found her abandoned Tesla at a remote overlook above the Pacific Coast Highway. Her phone, wallet, and wedding ring were inside. The only missing item was her passport, a detail that supported their theory of voluntary disappearance rather than foul play. "The detective called this morning," David said, settling beside Victoria on the Italian leather sofa that Sarah had carefully selected 3 years prior. "They're officially classifying it as a cold case. No new leads, no evidence of foul play. She's simply gone." Victoria's heart raced with excitement, though she kept her expression appropriately somber. "I know this is difficult for you, darling, but maybe now we can finally move forward with our lives." David pulled her close, and she inhaled his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the night everything had changed. "I love you, Vic. I never thought I could feel this way again after Sarah." He trailed off, as he always did when Sarah's name came up. Victoria had learned not to push. Men like David Morrison dealt with guilt in their own ways, and she was patient enough to let him process whatever lingering emotions remained. The doorbell chimed, its melodic tone echoing through the marble foyer. Victoria frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" David shook his head, already rising to answer it. Through the window, Victoria could see several black SUVs parked in the circular driveway. Her blood ran cold. "David Morrison?" The voice carried. From the front entrance, crisp, authoritative, official. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" "I'm Special Agent Maria Santos with the FBI. We'd like to ask you and Ms. Hale some questions regarding the disappearance of Sarah Chen Morrison." Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. "This wasn't supposed to happen. The local police had closed the case. They were home free." "Of course." David's voice carried a slight tremor. "Please, come in." Agent Santos entered with 3 other agents, their presence immediately transforming. the luxurious living room into an interrogation space. Santos was a petite woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the room. Her gaze lingered on the broken champagne glass, the celebratory bottle on the coffee table, the way Victoria's hands shook as she clutched David's arm. "I apologize for interrupting your evening," Santos said, though her tone suggested no such remorse. "We've reopened the investigation into Mrs. Morrison's disappearance based on new evidence." "New evidence?" David's voice cracked slightly. "But the case was closed. Detective Reynolds said—" "Detective Reynolds is no longer handling this case," Santos interrupted smoothly. "This is now a federal investigation. We have reason to believe that Mrs. Morrison's disappearance may be connected to interstate crimes." Victoria forced herself to speak. "What kind of crimes?" Santos studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Victoria felt the room spinning, slightly, the effects of champagne and adrenaline creating a dangerous cocktail in her system. "Murder?" David's voice rose an octave. "But there's no body. Sarah ran away. She couldn't handle the pressure of her business failing. You can't possibly think that we—" "Mr. Morrison," Agent Santos said quietly, "we know exactly what happened to your wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could hear her own heartbeat, could feel sweat beading along her hairline. Despite the air conditioning, this was impossible. They had been so careful, so meticulous in their planning. 3 months ago, Santos continued, consulting a file folder, Sarah Chen Morrison discovered that her husband was having an affair. But more than that, she discovered that he and his mistress were systematically embezzling money from her company. $2.3 million transferred to offshore accounts over the course of 18 months. Victoria's legs gave out, and she collapsed back onto the sofa. David remained standing, but she could see the color draining from his face. "That's impossible," David stammered. "Sarah's company was failing. There was no money to steal." Santos smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, your wife's company was thriving. The financial difficulties were manufactured by you and Ms. Hale. Fake invoices, phantom vendors, diverted payments. Sarah discovered everything on March 15th. She had scheduled a meeting with the FBI for March 18th. March 16th. The date was burned into Victoria's memory. The night Sarah Chen Morrison died. She never made it to that meeting," Santos continued relentlessly. "Because on March 16th, she confronted you both. There was a struggle, and Sarah Chen Morrison died in this very room." "You can't prove any of this!" Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as a harsh whisper. "There's no body, no crime scene." "Actually, there is." Santos nodded to one of her agents, who began setting up a portable black light. "You see, Ms. Hale, you made several critical mistakes. First, you assumed that cleaning products could eliminate all traces of blood. But luminol reveals what the naked eye cannot see." The agent switched on the black light, and Victoria gasped in horror. Glowing blue-white stains appeared across the hardwood floor, spatters and streaks that told a story of violence and desperate cleanup attempts. "Second," Santos continued, "you thought that dissolving a body in lye would eliminate all evidence. But Sarah's dental implants survived. We found them in the garden where you buried the remains." David made a strangled sound, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. Victoria felt as though she was watching the scene unfold from outside her body. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. "And third," Santos said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you assumed that Sarah Chen Morrison was dead when you dumped her in that lye solution." The room began to spin in earnest now. Victoria clutched at the sofa cushions, fighting waves of nausea. She was still alive, wasn't she, Ms. Hale? Unconscious from the head trauma, but alive. You knew because you checked for a pulse. But you were so panicked, so desperate to cover your tracks that you decided to proceed anyway." "No," Victoria whispered. "No, that's not. She was already dead. She hit her head on the coffee table and she was dead." "So you admit there was a struggle," Santos said quietly. The trap had been set perfectly, and Victoria had walked right into it. David was staring at her now with a mixture of horror and betrayal, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "We have security footage from a neighbor's camera," Santos continued. "It shows you and Mr. Morrison moving something heavy from the house to the garden shed at 2:47 a.m. on March 17th. We have cell phone records showing you researched lye solutions and body disposal methods. We have financial records showing the systematic theft from Chen Morrison Industries." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when she had started crying. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She came home early that night, caught us together. She was screaming about calling the police, about pressing charges. David grabbed her to stop her from leaving, and she fell." "Vic, shut up," David hissed, but it was too late. "She was unconscious, but she was breathing," Victoria continued, the words pouring out in a torrent of confession. "We panicked. We didn't know what to do. The financial fraud would have sent us both to prison. 6 months after that devastating night, when champagne turned to handcuffs, Victoria Hale sat in the defendant's chair of Federal Courtroom 7A, barely recognizable as the glamorous woman who had once celebrated in Sarah Chen Morrison's living room. Her once lustrous blonde hair hung limp and unwashed, her designer clothes replaced by an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The woman who had dreamed of being a millionaire's wife was now facing life in prison without parole. Across the courtroom, David Morrison avoided her gaze entirely. His high-powered legal team had negotiated a plea deal, 25 years in exchange for his testimony against Victoria. The man who had once whispered promises of forever in her ear would now take the witness stand as the prosecution's star witness. The defendant, Victoria Hale, prosecutor Amanda Chen, Sarah's younger sister, addressed the jury with controlled fury, "is a master manipulator who orchestrated not just theft, but cold-blooded murder. She seduced a married man, convinced him to betray his wife's trust, and when confronted with exposure, she made the calculated decision to end Sarah Chen Morrison's life." Victoria's court-appointed attorney, Marcus Webb, was competent but overworked. He'd tried to convince her to take a plea deal, but Victoria had refused. Even now, sitting in federal court with overwhelming evidence against her, she clung to the belief that she could somehow talk her way out of this nightmare. The first week of testimony was devastating. Agent Maria Santos took the stand and methodically destroyed every aspect of Victoria's defense. The financial records were damning. 18 months of systematic theft totaling $2.3 million, all traced back to accounts controlled by Victoria. The security footage was grainy, but clear enough to show two figures moving a large, heavy object from the house to the garden shed in the early hours of March 17th. But it was the forensic evidence that truly sealed Victoria's fate. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the FBI's forensic pathologist, explained to the hushed courtroom how Sarah's dental implants had been recovered from what remained of her body. "The titanium implants survived the lye solution," Dr. Torres testified, her voice clinical and precise. "We were able to match them definitively to Mrs. Morrison's dental records. We also found traces of her DNA on gardening tools recovered from the shed." Victoria watched the jury's faces as they absorbed each piece of evidence. She could see their disgust, their horror, their complete lack of sympathy for her situation. These 12 people, teachers, retirees, small business owners, looked at her like she was something inhuman. The prosecution's case was methodical and merciless. They established motive through the financial fraud, means through the physical, evidence and opportunity through cell phone records that placed both defendants at the house during the time of Sarah's death. But it was the timeline that truly damned Victoria. On March 15th, Amanda Chen told the jury, Sarah Chen Morrison discovered the theft. She spent that evening gathering evidence, bank statements, forged invoices, email chains between the defendants. She was preparing to turn everything over to the FBI on March 18th. The defendants knew they had a 48-hour window before their crimes would be exposed. Victoria's hands trembled as she watched the prosecutor display blown-up photographs of Sarah's meticulous documentation. The dead woman had been thorough, compiling a case that would have sent both Victoria and David to prison for decades. It was a race against time, and Victoria had chosen the most desperate solution. On the fourth day of testimony, David Morrison took the stand. He looked older than his 52 years, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a broken man. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost in jail, and his hands shook as he was sworn in. When his eyes briefly met Victoria's across the courtroom, she saw not love or loyalty, but fear and disgust. "Mr. Morrison," Amanda Chen began, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant." David's voice was barely above a whisper. "Victoria and I began having an affair approximately 2 years ago. I was unhappy in my marriage. Sarah was always working, always focused on her business. Victoria made me feel young again, desired." Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't how their love story was supposed to be told. Reduced to cliches and justifications in a criminal courtroom. "When did you first become involved in stealing from your wife's company?" Amanda continued. "Victoria suggested it about 18 months ago," David said, and Victoria's lawyer immediately objected to the characterization. After a brief sidebar, David continued. "We discussed the financial situation. Sarah's company was doing well, but most of the assets were in her name. If we divorced, I would have gotten very little. The prenup was restrictive. So you decided to steal from your wife instead?" David's face crumpled. It seemed like a solution. Victoria said we could take just enough to start fresh somewhere else. She said Sarah would never notice. The amounts were small at first, a few thousand here and there. But Victoria knew that wasn't true, and apparently, so did the prosecutor. "The amounts weren't small, were they, Mr. Morrison? According to the financial records, you stole increasingly larger sums over 18 months. The final transfer, just 2 days before Sarah's murder, was for $400,000. "Yes," David whispered. "Victoria said we needed more. She said Sarah was getting suspicious, that we needed to take what we could before she discovered everything." Victoria wanted to scream, to tell the court that David was lying, that he had been just as eager, just as greedy as she was. But her lawyer had warned her against outbursts, and she forced herself to remain silent. "Tell the court about the night of March 16th, Amanda Chen said. David took a shuddering breath. "Sarah came home unexpectedly. She'd been in Seattle at a conference, but her flight got changed. Victoria and I were together in the bedroom when we heard the front door. Sarah found us there." The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning system. "What happened next?" Sarah was furious. She said she knew about the money, that she had proof of everything. She had a folder with her, bank statements, printed emails. She said she was calling the FBI in the morning, that we were both going to prison. And then David's voice broke completely. "Victoria grabbed the folder from her. Sarah tried to get it back, and they struggled. I tried to separate them, but Victoria was in a rage. She pushed Sarah hard. Sarah fell backward and hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. Victoria finally couldn't contain herself. "That's not what happened," she screamed, surging to her feet. "You're lying. You grabbed her first. You were the one who—" The judge's gavel came down like thunder. "Miss Hale, sit down immediately or you will be removed from this courtroom." Marcus Webb pulled Victoria back into her chair, whispering urgent warnings in her ear, but the damage was done. The jury had seen her violent outburst, her complete loss of control. In that moment, she had shown them exactly what kind of person she really was. David continued his testimony through tears. After Sarah fell, there was so much blood. We thought she was dead. But then Victoria checked for a pulse and said she was still alive, just unconscious. What did you do then? I wanted to call 911, David said, his voice barely audible. But Victoria said it was too late. She said if Sarah woke up, we'd both go to prison for assault and theft. She said there was only one way to protect ourselves. Amanda Chen let the silence stretch before asking the question that would haunt Victoria for the rest of her life. Mr. Morrison, who made the decision to kill your wife? David looked directly at Victoria for the first time during his testimony. Victoria did. She said we had to finish what we'd started. She said Sarah would never stop coming after us if she lived. The prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks of testimony. Victoria's defense was brief and desperate. Claims that David had manipulated her, that she was just a young woman in love who had been led astray by an older, more experienced man. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Victoria's own recorded confession on the night of her arrest had eliminated any possibility of reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. We, the jury, find the defendant, Victoria Hale, guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, guilty of identity theft, guilty of obstruction of justice. Each verdict hit Victoria like a physical blow. By the time the foreman finished reading, she was sobbing uncontrollably, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling completely. During the sentencing hearing 3 weeks later, Amanda Chen read a victim impact statement on behalf of Sarah's family. Sarah Chen Morrison was a brilliant entrepreneur, a loving daughter, and a woman who trusted the wrong people, Amanda said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She built a company that employed over 200 people. She mentored young women in technology. She donated millions to educational charities. Her death wasn't just the end of one life. It was the destruction of all the good she would have done in the decades to come. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, had presided over dozens of murder cases during her 20-year career. But something about this case had clearly affected her deeply.